Some women are forged by hardship into something stronger than steel. Nora Gaines was one of them. In the blazing summer of 1884, 6 months pregnant and alone on the Santa Fe Trail, she faced a choice that would define her life. When her prairie carriage snapped its axle under the merciless Arizona sun, most folks would have sat down and wept. Not Nora. With calloused hands and fierce determination, she jacked up that wagon, trimmed mesquite wood for a new beam, and hammered iron back into place with nothing but raw grit and the life growing inside her belly. She had survived losing her husband, losing her home, and now she would survive this too. But when Clayton Ridge, a wealthy cattleman with silver mines and vast herds, rode up expecting to play hero, he found something he never expected: a woman who didn't need rescuing. What happens when pride meets generosity on a dusty trail where survival depends on more than money or good intentions? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust settled around Nora's boots as she stood back from her handiwork, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. The wedding ring that hung from a thin gold chain around her neck caught the late afternoon light, sending brief flashes across the weathered wood of her wagon bed. Thomas's ring, she touched it through the fabric of her dress, a habit formed in the 6 months since his funeral. He would have been proud to see her now, she reckoned, though he might have chuckled at the sight of his refined Boston bride wrestling with axles and wagon wheels under the Arizona sun. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd traveled from the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill to this dusty stretch of nowhere, carrying nothing but her sewing skills, her savings, and the child that kicked restlessly beneath her heart. Thomas had promised her adventure when they'd married and headed west to his mining claim in Colorado. He'd delivered on that promise, though not in the way either of them had expected. Adventure, she'd learned, often wore the face of hardship. Clayton Ridge sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, watching this remarkable woman work with a fascination that surprised him. He'd been riding hard from his ranch outside Tucson, bound for a meeting with railroad investors in Santa Fe, when he'd spotted the disabled wagon from the ridge above. His first instinct had been to ride down and take charge, fix whatever needed fixing, load the stranded traveler into his rig, and send them on their way with his blessing and a few silver dollars for their trouble. But this woman had turned his assumptions inside out from the moment he'd dismounted. When he'd offered to take over the repairs, she'd fixed him with eyes the color of sage after rain and told him in no uncertain terms that she was managing just fine. Thank you kindly. When he'd persisted, suggesting that a lady in her condition shouldn't be wrestling with heavy wagon parts, those same green eyes had flashed with something between amusement and irritation. "Mister," she'd said, not pausing in her work, "this baby's got 4 more months to grow, and I've got a business to start. Neither one's going to wait for me to find a man willing to do what I can do myself." He'd never met a woman quite like her. The ladies of his acquaintance, the daughters of other ranchers, the wives of his business associates were certainly capable in their own ways, but their capabilities ran to managing households and hosting dinner parties. They arranged flowers and planned charitable events, all admirable pursuits, but none that would serve a woman stranded alone on a desert trail with a broken wagon and a baby on the way. Clayton owned 3 ranches, 2 silver mines, and enough cattle to stock half of Arizona territory. He'd built his fortune through careful calculation and strategic alliances, and he'd learned to read people the way he read the sky for weather signs. This woman, though she defied easy reading, her hands told one story, rough and capable from hard work, while her voice carried the educated cadences of someone who'd known a different life. Her dress was travel-worn but well-made, and she wore her hair in a simple bun that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. "Name's Clayton Ridge," he'd offered during one of her brief pauses, tipping his hat. "I own the Copper Creek Ranch, south of here." "Nora Gaines?" she'd replied, glancing up from where she was lashing the new axle beam with strips of rawhide. "And I'm bound for Esperanza, assuming this rig holds together long enough to get me there." Esperanza. Clayton knew the Tona small settlement that had grown up around a reliable water source, home to perhaps 200 souls trying to scratch a living from unforgiving land. It wasn't the sort of place that attracted much attention from the outside world, which made him curious about what had drawn this determined woman there. "Planning to visit family?" he'd asked, offering her his water bottle when she paused to catch her breath. She'd accepted the water gratefully, drinking deeply before answering. "Planning to stay. I've purchased a lot on Main Street, sight unseen. Going to open a seamstress shop." Her hand had moved unconsciously to rest on her rounded belly. Figure folks everywhere need their clothes mended and altered, and a woman with a child needs steady work. The simple pragmatism of it impressed him. She wasn't chasing dreams or running from ghosts. She was building a life with the tools and skills she possessed. It reminded him of his own beginnings, when he'd arrived in Arizona territory with little more than determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around him. As the afternoon wore on, Clayton found himself reluctant to leave. He told himself he was being neighborly, making sure she got her wagon rolling safely before he continued his journey. But truthfully, he was captivated by watching her work. She moved with economy and purpose, every action deliberate and effective. When she needed to lift something heavy, she found ways to leverage her weight and use tools to her advantage rather than relying on brute strength she didn't possess. The sun was sliding toward the western mountains when she finally stepped back from the completed repair, hands on her hips as she surveyed her handiwork. The new axle beam was rough-hewn but solid, wrapped tight with rawhide and secured with iron fittings. She'd somehow managed to reshape with nothing but a hammer and the anvil surface of a large rock. "That should hold," she said, more to herself than to him. Then, glancing his way, she added, "I'm obliged for the loan of your tools and the water. This desert heat takes some getting used to." Clayton found himself oddly reluctant to accept her dismissal. "Where are you coming from, if you don't mind my asking? Your accent suggests somewhere back east." For the first time since he'd known her all of 3 hours, but it somehow felt longer, she seemed to hesitate. Her fingers found that chain around her neck again, and he saw something vulnerable flicker across her features before she squared her shoulders. "Boston, originally, then Colorado for a time." She began loading her scattered tools back into the wagon bed. "My husband had a mining claim near Leadville. Good silver ground, but the mountain winters are hard on a man's lungs. He passed last winter, and she trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. "I decided it was time for a fresh start somewhere the sun shines more than it snows." The explanation was simple enough, but Clayton caught the weight of grief in her voice, the careful way she spoke of her husband's death. He'd known his share of Los Ranching and mining were both unforgiving occupations, but he'd never carried the additional burden of widowhood and impending motherhood. The courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar and strike out alone impressed him more than her skill with wagon repairs. "Esperanza's a good town," he offered. "Honest folks mostly. They'll appreciate a skilled seamstress." He paused, then added, "Though I should mention, the land around there's been drawing some attention lately. Railroad surveyors have been through, and where the railroad goes, change follows. Could be good for business, or it could complicate things for folks already settled." She looked up sharply at that. "What kind of complications?" "Hard to say. Sometimes the railroad brings prosperity, new customers, easier shipping of goods. Sometimes it brings speculators and land grabbers who push out the folks who built the town in the first place." He studied her face, noting the way her jaw tightened. "I mention it because a woman alone, especially one with property, well, it's wise to be prepared for pressure from folks who might see opportunity in your situation." Nora absorbed this information silently, her hands continuing to secure her tools with practiced efficiency. Finally, she nodded. "I appreciate the warning. I've dealt with men who think widows are easy marks before. Usually only takes one conversation to set them straight." There was steel in her voice that made Clayton believe her. Still, something protective stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling that caught him off guard. He was accustomed to being the one others looked to for help and protection, but his concern usually extended to his employees and business associates. This stranger had no claim on his assistance, had actively refused it, in fact, yet he found himself reluctant to ride away and leave her to face whatever challenges awaited in Esperanza. The first evening stars were appearing when she finished her preparations and climbed up onto the wagon seat. She gathered the reins in her capable hands and looked down at him with an expression that might have been gratitude, though it was hard to tell in the gathering dusk. "Thank you for staying," she said simply. "It was kind of you to keep me company during the work." Clayton mounted his own horse, settling into the saddle with the unconscious ease of long practice. "My pleasure, Mrs. Gaines. I hope Esperanza proves everything you're hoping for." She nodded, then clicked to her horse, and the wagon began to roll forward with only the slightest wobble from the makeshift repair. Clayton watched until the dust and darkness swallowed the sight of her, then turned his own mount toward the north and his interrupted journey. But as he rode through the cool desert night, his thoughts kept returning to sage-green eyes and calloused hands, to the quiet courage of a woman who faced the unknown with nothing but her own strength and determination. Nora Gaines had gotten under his skin in a way that surprised him, and he found himself wondering if their paths might cross again. In Esperanza, perhaps, where the railroad might bring changes that could affect them both in ways neither could yet imagine. 3 hours after Clayton Ridge had disappeared into the gathering darkness, Nora was beginning to question the wisdom of continuing her journey by moonlight. The desert held different dangers after sunset, not just the obvious perils of losing the trail or foundering in an unseen wash, but the subtle threats that came with dropping temperatures and the creatures that emerged to hunt when the sun's heat no longer pressed them into hiding. Still, she'd made good time since leaving the repair site, and the bright three-quarter moon provided enough light to keep her on the well-traveled path toward Esperanza. Her makeshift axle repair held steady, though she could feel a slight vibration through the wagon seat that hadn't been there before. Nothing alarming, but it served as a constant reminder of how precarious her situation truly was. The bolt of blue fabric in the wagon bed behind her represented more than just merchandise. It was her future, her independence, her ability to provide for the child she carried. She'd spent the last of her savings on that particular cloth, a fine wool blend that would make beautiful dresses for the ladies of Esperanza. The deep blue matched her vision for the dress she'd wear to her shop's grand opening, professional but approachable, the sort of attire that would inspire confidence in potential customers. That fabric, along with her other sewing supplies and the small leather pouch containing her remaining money, constituted everything she owned in the world besides the wagon itself and the sturdy mare pulling it. The mare Belle had been Thomas's horse, a patient creature with an even temperament that made her perfect for the long journey from Colorado. Thomas had always said Belle had more sense than most people he knew, and tonight Nora was grateful for that wisdom. The horse's ears swiveled constantly, alert to sounds and scents that Nora's human senses couldn't detect. It was Belle who first sensed the wrongness in the air. The mare's head came up sharply, her pace slowing as she snorted and sidestepped nervously. Nora felt it too, a subtle change in the atmosphere, a heaviness that made her skin prickle despite the cool night air. Looking up, she saw that clouds had moved in from the west, obscuring the stars and making the moonlight diffuse and uncertain. The first drops of rain were almost welcome, a relief from the day's heat that made her lift her face to catch the moisture. But within minutes, the gentle sprinkle transformed into something far more dangerous. The drops grew larger, harder, drumming against the canvas cover of her wagon with increasing intensity. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder that seemed to echo off the mountains on either side of the valley. Flash floods. Clayton had mentioned them earlier, one of the many hazards of desert travel that Eastern sensibilities struggled to comprehend. How could a landscape so dry and seemingly lifeless suddenly become a raging torrent? But Thomas had told her stories of Colorado mountain floods, walls of water that appeared with little warning to sweep away everything in their path. The desert version would be no different, perhaps even more treacherous because of the hard-packed earth that couldn't absorb the sudden deluge. Nora urged Belle to move faster, scanning the landscape for higher ground. The trail they followed ran along the bottom of a broad wash, the very feature that made it a natural roadway, also making it a potential death trap. She needed to get to elevation, but in the darkness and rain, it was difficult to judge distances or identify suitable shelter. The rain intensified, driven by wind that made the wagon canvas snap and billow. Belle was struggling now, her hooves slipping on ground that had turned slick with the first moisture it had seen in months. The sound of rushing water reached Nora's ears, not the gentle patter of rain, but the deeper, more ominous roar of water, moving with purpose and power. When the wall of water hit, it came from a side canyon she hadn't even noticed in the darkness. One moment she was fighting to keep Belle moving forward through the increasingly treacherous conditions, and the next moment the world exploded into chaos. The flood struck the side of her wagon with the force of a freight train, lifting the entire rig and spinning it like a child's toy. Nora felt herself thrown from the seat, her hands instinctively wrapping around her belly to protect the child within as she hit the turbulent water. The shock of the cold almost drove the breath from her lungs, but somehow she managed to grab onto a piece of floating debris part of her wagon bed. She realized with sick despair and pull herself partially out of the current. The water carried her downstream with terrifying speed, and she caught glimpses of her possessions scattered in the torrent around her. Her precious bolt of blue fabric unfurled like a banner in the flood, the fine wool darkening as it absorbed water before disappearing entirely into the churning darkness. Her sewing supplies, her few pieces of furniture, her clothes, everything she owned, was being swept away in the span of minutes. Belle was gone. Nora caught sight of the mare's pale form, struggling in the water somewhere downstream, but then a bend in the wash took the horse from view. The poor creature had served faithfully through the long journey from Colorado, and now she was likely lost to the same flood that was destroying everything else Nora had worked to build. Time became elastic in the water. She might have been fighting the current for minutes or hours. The cold and the shock made it impossible to judge. Her grip on the piece of wagon wood was beginning to slip, her hands too numb to maintain their hold much longer. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the danger they faced, and she pressed her face against the rough wood and whispered fierce promises to the child she might never get to hold. When the debris finally caught against a stand of desert willows, Nora barely had the strength to pull herself onto the muddy bank. She lay there, gasping, water streaming from her hair and clothes, her whole body shaking with cold and exhaustion. The flood roared past her refuge, carrying away the last remnants of her old life with indifferent efficiency. Gradually, the sound of rushing water began to fade, and the rain gentled to a steady drizzle. Nora struggled to sit up, taking inventory of her situation with the methodical approach that had served her through previous crises. She was alive, and the baby seemed unharmed still, moving normally, not showing signs of distress. She was soaked through and beginning to shiver as the desert night's chill penetrated her wet clothes, but she had no obvious injuries beyond scrapes and bruises. Everything else was gone. Her wagon, her horse, her possessions, her money, all swept away in the space of a few terrifying minutes. She was stranded miles from the nearest settlement, pregnant and alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the ring that still hung around her neck. Thomas's gold somehow having survived when everything else had been lost. The irony was bitter. She'd survived her husband's death, sold everything they'd built together in Colorado, and traveled hundreds of miles to start fresh in Arizona territory. She'd fixed her own wagon, stood up to well-meaning men who wanted to manage her life, and proven to herself that she could handle whatever challenges came her way. And now, just hours away from her destination, a single act of nature had reduced her to exactly the sort of helpless victim she'd fought so hard not to become. Dawn was still hours away when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Perhaps someone had come looking for survivors of the flood. But caution made her press deeper into the shadows of the willows. A lone woman in her condition would be vulnerable to the wrong sort of rescuer, and she'd learn to be careful about revealing herself to strangers. The rider came into view as he guided his horse carefully along the flood-scoured wash, a lantern held high to illuminate the debris field. Even in the uncertain light, she recognized the broad shoulders and easy seat that marked Clayton Ridge. He'd come back, though she couldn't imagine why. Their brief acquaintance hardly obligated him to risk his own safety, searching for her in the aftermath of a flash flood. "Mrs. Gaines," his voice carried clearly in the still air. "Nora, can you hear me?" The sound of her name, spoken with such concern by someone who was little more than a stranger, broke something loose inside her chest. She'd been strong for so long, carrying the weight of grief and responsibility and determination, with barely a pause to acknowledge the burden. But sitting in the mud beside a flood-swollen wash, everything she'd worked for scattered to the winds, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her losses. "Here," she called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion and emotion. "I'm here." Clayton's lantern swung in her direction, and she saw his shoulders sag with relief as he spotted her huddled form among the willows. He dismounted quickly, securing his horse before making his way carefully across the uneven ground to where she sat. "Thank God," he said simply, kneeling beside her in the mud without regard for his own clothes. "I was afraid." He trailed off, but she could hear the rest of the sentence in his voice. He'd been afraid she was dead, swept away like so many others who underestimated the desert's capacity for sudden violence. "Everything's gone," she said, the words coming out flat and matter-of-fact. "The wagon, Belle, all my things, everything." Clayton shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the warm wool immediately cutting through the chill that had settled into her bones. "You're alive," he said firmly. "You and the baby. That's what matters." She wanted to argue, to explain that without her possessions and her money, being alive was only the beginning of her problems. But the warmth of his coat and the solid comfort of his presence made the fight go out of her. She was so tired, so overwhelmed by the magnitude of starting over from absolutely nothing, that for once in her life she simply accepted help when it was offered. "Take my wagon, my stock, my name," Clayton said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Let me see you safe." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Nora found herself staring into eyes that reflected nothing but honest concern and something deeper that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The silver spurs on Clayton's boots caught the first light of dawn as he helped Nora into his wagon, the polished metal gleaming with the sort of craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and status. They were beautiful things, engraved with intricate patterns and fitted with tiny silver bells that chimed softly with each step, the kind of ornament a man wore when he wanted the world to know he'd risen above his humble beginnings. Nora noticed them because she noticed everything now, her senses sharpened by exhaustion and the strange vulnerability of accepting help from someone who was essentially a stranger. Those spurs represented everything she'd tried to avoid in coming to Arizona: territory dependence on a man's generosity, the unspoken obligations that came with rescue, the way wealth could make decisions for people who had none. "I'll take you as far as Esperanza," Clayton had said when she'd finally agreed to his help. "You can decide what comes next once you've had some rest and a hot meal." It was a reasonable offer, even generous, but something in his tone suggested he'd already begun making plans that extended beyond simply delivering her to town. She'd heard that note before in men's voices, the assumption that a woman alone, especially one in desperate circumstances, would naturally be grateful for any permanent arrangement that offered security. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent the previous day proving her independence by repairing her own wagon, only to find herself the next morning accepting charity from the very man who'd witnessed her self-reliance. Pride warred with practicality in her chest, but practicality won. She was 6 months pregnant, had lost everything in the flood, and was still hours away from her destination. Refusing help would be foolish, even if accepting it felt like swallowing glass. Clayton's wagon was everything hers. hadn't been well maintained, comfortable, pulled by a matched pair of horses that responded to the slightest touch of the reins. The seat was padded leather instead of rough wood, and the bed was fitted with proper springs that absorbed the bumps and jolts of the trail. It was the sort of conveyance that announced its owner's prosperity to anyone who saw it passing, which made Nora acutely aware of the picture they presented. A wealthy rancher and a bedraggled woman who looked like she'd been pulled from a flood, which, she reflected grimly, was exactly what she was. "There's coffee in the thermos," Clayton offered, as they settled into a steady pace toward Esperanza. "And some biscuits wrapped in that cloth. You should eat something." The coffee was still warm, rich and strong, in a way that spoke of quality beans and careful preparation. Nora wrapped her hands around the tin cup gratefully, letting the heat seep into her still-chilled fingers. The biscuits were light and flaky, the kind that required skilled hands and fresh ingredients, not the sort of trail food most travelers carried. "Do you always travel so well provisioned?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her natural reticence. Clayton's mouth quirked in what might have been embarrassment. "Mrs. Chen at the ranch insisted on packing enough food to feed an army. She's convinced I'll waste away to nothing if left to my own devices for more than a day." He glanced at her sideways. "She's probably right. I tend to forget about meals when I'm focused on business." It was a small glimpse into his life, the casual mention of household staff, and the sort of prosperity that made forgetting meals a luxury rather than a necessity. Nora filed the information away, adding it to her growing understanding of the man who'd rescued her. Wealthy enough to employ servants, successful enough to travel to meetings with railroad investors, but still willing to spend the night searching flood debris for a stranger. "What made you come back?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since he'd appeared beside the wash. "You had your own business to attend to." Clayton was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful quality that suggested he'd been asking himself the same question. "I got about 10 miles north before I started thinking about that flash flood warning," he said. "Desert storms can be unpredictable, and that wash you were traveling through." He shook his head. "I kept thinking about you out there alone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have insisted you wait until morning to continue your journey." "I wouldn't have listened," Nora said honestly. "I was determined to reach Esperanza." "I know. That's what worried me." He glanced at her again, and she caught something in his expression that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "You're not the sort of woman who accepts limitations easily, are you?" The observation was perceptive enough to make her uncomfortable. She'd spent so much energy projecting strength and capability that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen clearly by someone else. Thomas had known her stubborn streak intimately, had learned to work with it rather than against it, but he'd had years to study her moods and motivations. This man had known her less than a day, yet he'd already identified one of her defining characteristics. "Limitations are often just other people's opinions," she said carefully. "I've found that most things are possible if you're willing to work hard enough and pay the price required." "And what price are you willing to pay for independence?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Independence had cost her Thomas's disapproval when she'd insisted on helping with the mining claim. It had cost her the security of staying in Colorado among people who knew her. Now it might cost her the chance to build the life she'd envisioned in Esperanza, since she no longer had the resources to open her shop. "Whatever's necessary," she said finally, though the words felt less certain than they once had. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels finding a rhythm on the packed earth of the trail. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of the previous night's storm and revealing the damage the flood had done to the landscape. Debris hung from tree branches 20 feet above the normal level of the wash, testament to the power of the water that had swept away her belongings. Other travelers began appearing on the road as the morning progressed, freight wagons heading north toward the railroad, riders carrying mail and messages between settlements, families making the journey to visit relatives or conduct business in town. Several nodded politely as they passed, but Nora noticed the way their eyes lingered on her, and Clayton, curious about the story behind their unlikely pairing. "People are going to talk," she said quietly, as another group of riders passed with barely concealed interest. "Let them," Clayton replied, but there was tension in his voice that suggested he was more aware of the implications than he wanted to admit. "You're a woman who's suffered losses in a flood, and I'm offering assistance. Nothing scandalous in that." But Nora had lived long enough to know that scandal was often a matter of perception rather than fact. A wealthy, unmarried man traveling alone with a pregnant widow would provide fodder for gossip, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. In a small community like Esperanza, such talk could follow her for years, affecting her ability to build the respectable business she'd planned. "It might be better if you let me off at the edge of town," she said. "I can walk the rest of the way, tell people I found shelter during the storm and made it to safety on my own." Clayton's hands tightened on the reins, and those silver spurs rang softly as he shifted his position on the wagon seat. "You're worried about your reputation." "I'm worried about my future," she corrected. "A seamstress depends on the good opinion of the community. If people think I'm—" She paused, searching for the right words. "If they get the wrong impression about our association, it could affect my business before I even have a chance to establish it." "And what impression would that be?" The question was asked mildly, but Nora caught the edge underneath. She touched on something that mattered to him, though she wasn't sure whether it was his own reputation or hers that concerned him more. "You know what impression," she said. "A rich man and a woman in desperate circumstances. People will assume I'm trading favors for assistance, whether that's true or not." Clayton was quiet for several minutes, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its casual tone. "Is that what you think? That I'm expecting favors in exchange for help?" The hurt in his voice surprised her. She'd been so focused on protecting herself from potential complications that she hadn't considered how her assumptions might sound to him. But now, hearing his reaction, she realized she might have misjudged both his character and his motivations. "No," she said honestly, "I don't think that. But what I think doesn't matter if other people draw different conclusions. Other people's conclusions aren't your responsibility." Easy to say when you're not the one who has to live with the consequences. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Years of experience with the way women's reputations could be destroyed, by association giving them an edge of bitterness. Clayton pulled the wagon to a stop beside the road, turning to face her fully. His eyes were serious, and she could see that her words had struck home. "You're right," he said simply. "I apologize. I haven't had to consider how my actions might affect someone else's standing in the community." He paused, then added, "It's been a long time since I've cared enough about anyone to worry about their reputation." The admission hung between them, more intimate than anything physical might have been. Nora felt her breath catch, recognizing the shift in their dynamic, even as she tried to resist it. This was how it started, small moments of understanding, careful revelations that drew two people closer together despite their better judgment. "Clayton," she said quietly, using his given name for the first time. "I'm grateful for your help, more grateful than I can properly express. But I need you to understand that I can't afford complications right now. I have a child to think about, a business to build, a life to establish. I can't be anyone's romantic interest or convenient arrangement." He nodded slowly, and she saw acceptance in his expression, along with something that might have been disappointment. "I understand, and I respect that." He gathered the reins again, preparing to continue their journey. "But Nora, when you're ready to stop running from every possibility that might involve trusting someone else, I hope you'll remember that not all offers of help come with strings attached." The wagon began moving again, carrying them toward Esperanza and whatever future awaited her there. But his words echoed in her mind, challenging assumptions she'd held for so long that she'd forgotten they were choices rather than facts. Trust was a luxury she'd convinced herself she couldn't afford. But perhaps the real question was whether she could afford to keep living without it. Esperanza looked exactly like what it was, a town carved from hope and stubbornness in equal measure. The main street stretched perhaps 3 blocks between weathered buildings that seemed to lean into each other for support against the desert wind. A few cottonwoods provided blessed shade near the town well, their leaves rustling with the promise of water in a landscape that hoarded every drop like treasure. Nora's sewing kit lay secure in her lap, the one possession that had survived the flood intact. She'd found it wedged against a boulder downstream, the leather case battered but whole, its contents safe within the carefully organized compartments Thomas had designed for her. The ivory thimble, the silver scissors, the array of needles and pince-these tools represented more than her trade. They were her path to independence, her means of supporting herself and her child without relying on anyone else's charity. Clayton had been true to his word about avoiding the appearance of impropriety, stopping the wagon at the edge of town and helping her down with careful formality. But his presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Several townsfolk had emerged from their shops and homes, curiosity drawing them to witness the arrival of the wealthy rancher and his unexpected passenger. "Mrs. Gaines," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I hope you find Esperanza everything you're looking for." The formal words were meant for their audience, but Nora caught the concern in his eyes as he handed her the small bundle of supplies. He'd insisted she take a blanket, some food, and a few silver dollars pressed into her palm, despite her protests. It was charity, plain and simple, but it was also survival, and she'd learned to swallow her pride when circumstances demanded it. "Thank you, Mr. Ridge," she replied, matching his formal tone. "Your kindness won't be forgotten." He touched his hat brim, climbed back onto his wagon, and departed without another word, leaving Nora standing in the dusty street with her meager possessions and a growing audience of curious neighbors. The first to approach was a woman about her own age, brown-haired and practical-looking, with the sort of direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to getting straight answers to her questions. "I'm Margaret Wells," she said, extending a work-roughened hand. "My husband runs the general store. You must be the seamstress who bought the lot on 2nd Street. Word traveled fast in small towns, apparently. Nora accepted the handshake gratefully, relieved to be welcomed rather than interrogated about her dramatic arrival. Nora Gaines. "And yes, I'm hoping to open a shop, though I'm afraid my plans have been complicated by recent events." Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "We heard about the flash flood. Lost everything, did you?" The sympathy in her voice was genuine, and Nora felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Whatever gossip might eventually circulate about her association with Clayton Ridge, at least the immediate reaction was one of neighborly concern. "Most everything," she confirmed, "but I still have my skills and my tools. That's a start." "More than a start," Margaret said firmly. "Agnes Mueller at the boarding house has been complaining for months about needing alterations on her dresses. And with the railroad surveyors coming through, there's been more call for mending and tailoring than our little community can handle. You'll have customers before you can hang out a sign." The mention of railroad surveyors made Nora think of Clayton's warning about changes coming to the region. But for now, the prospect of immediate work was more important than long-term concerns about development and progress. Margaret guided her through the town, pointing out the essential establishments: Dr. Harrison's office, the church, the schoolhouse, the saloon that served decent meals to those who couldn't or wouldn't cook for themselves. Esperanza might be small, but it had the infrastructure of a community that intended to endure. The lot Nora had purchased, sight unseen, turned out to be well situated, right on Main Street, between the general store and the bank. It was empty except for the foundation stones left by some previous owner's abandoned building project, but the location was prime for a business that depended on foot traffic and visibility. "Good spot," Margaret observed as they stood surveying the property. "Old Pete Martinez was going to build a cantina here, but he got the fever 2 winters back. His widow sold to pay debts. You got it for a fair price, I'd guess." Nora nodded, though the fair price had represented most of her savings at the time of purchase. Now, with her remaining money lost in the flood, the empty lot felt less like an opportunity and more like a monument to her miscalculation. "I'll need to find work while I figure out how to build," she said, as much to herself as to Margaret. "Maybe I can set up temporarily in a room somewhere, take in sewing and alterations while I save for construction." "Agnes Mueller has a spare room at the boarding house," Margaret offered. "She's been looking for a reliable tenant, and she'd probably appreciate having someone handy with a needle living under her roof. Her arthritis has been making fine work difficult." It wasn't the grand opening Nora had envisioned, but it was a path forward. She could build a customer base while living modestly, saving every penny until she had enough to construct a proper shop. It would take longer than she'd planned, and she'd be cutting it close with the baby's arrival, but it was possible. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and Nora turned to see a man in a dusty black suit riding toward them on a bay horse. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the sort of soft features that suggested he made his living with words rather than physical labor. His clothes were well made but travel-worn, and he wore a gold watch chain that caught the sunlight as he dismounted. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat with practiced charm, "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting our new resident." Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction Nora filed away for future consideration. "This is Mrs. Nora Gaines," Margaret said stiffly. "She's the seamstress who bought the Martinez lot. Nora, this is Silas Crane. He's in land speculation." The pause before Margaret's description of Crane's occupation spoke volumes, and Nora felt her guard rise instinctively. She'd dealt with enough men in speculation to recognize the type smooth-talking predators who made their living from other people's desperation and ignorance. "Mrs. Gaines," Crane said, his smile widening as he took in her obvious circumstances. "How delightful to meet you. I understand you've had some recent misfortunes with the flood." Terrible business, that. Nature can be so cruel to those who aren't prepared for her moods. There was something patronizing in his tone that made Nora's teeth clench, but she managed a polite nod. "I'm managing, Mr. Crane. Thank you for your concern." Of course. But I do hope you'll consider that your current situation might present certain opportunities for reconsideration. Land ownership is a significant responsibility, especially for someone in your delicate condition." His eyes dropped meaningfully to her rounded belly. "Perhaps we could discuss alternatives that might better serve your immediate needs." The offer was couched in concern, but Nora heard the calculation underneath. He wanted her land, probably had his eye on it before she'd even arrived in town. Her obvious vulnerability after the flood would make her seem like easy prey to someone in his line of work. "My condition doesn't affect my ability to honor my commitments, Mr. Crane," she said coolly. "I purchased that lot in good faith, and I intend to build on it as planned." Crane's smile never wavered, but something sharp flickered in his eyes. "Admirable determination, Mrs. Gaines. But determination doesn't pay construction costs or support a growing family. If you should reconsider, and I do hope you'll think carefully about your options, I'd be happy to make you a generous offer for the property. More than generous, considering the current market conditions." Margaret stepped closer to Nora's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by any of them. "Mrs. Gaines seems perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her property, Silas." "I'm sure she is," Crane replied smoothly. "I'm simply offering neighborly assistance to someone who might benefit from flexibility in her arrangements." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, then looked down at Nora with what might have been pity or might have been predatory interest. "Do think about it, Mrs. Gaines. I'll be staying at the hotel for the next few days if you'd like to discuss terms." He rode away without waiting for a response, leaving Nora with the distinct impression that she'd just been marked as prey by someone who made a living from other people's difficulties. "Don't trust him," Margaret said quietly once Crane was out of earshot. "He's been sniffing around town for months, making offers on properties and asking questions about mineral rights and water access. Some folks say he's working for investors back east, trying to buy up land cheap before the railroad comes through." The warning echoed Clayton's earlier words about speculators and change, making Nora wonder if her arrival in Esperanza had been even more poorly timed than she'd realized. But she'd survived worse than land sharks and smooth-talking conmen. The trick was not to let them see how desperate she really was. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her sewing kit. "Right now, I need to focus on finding work and a place to stay. Everything else can wait." Margaret nodded approvingly. Practical thinking. "Come on, let's go talk to Agnes about that room, and I'll introduce you to some of the other ladies who might need sewing done. Word will spread quickly once they see your work." As they walked toward the boarding house, Nora allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. She'd lost nearly everything in the flood, but she still had her skills, her determination, and apparently at least one ally in this small community. It wasn't the grand beginning she'd envisioned, but it was a foundation she could build on. Behind them, the empty lot sat waiting in the afternoon sun, holding space for dreams that might still be possible with enough time, effort, and the kind of stubborn hope that had brought her this far. The railroad might bring changes and complications. Men like Silas Crane might see opportunity in her difficulties, but Nora Gaines had survived worse storms than anything Esperanza could throw at her. At least, she hoped she had. The surveyor's stakes had appeared overnight, like a rash of wooden pocks across Esperanza's landscape. Nora first noticed them during her morning walk to the general store. Thin posts driven into the ground at precise intervals, each one marked with cryptic numbers and symbols that meant nothing to her but everything to the men who'd placed them there. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival in town, 3 weeks of building a modest clientele through careful work and Margaret Wells's enthusiastic recommendations. She'd taken the room at Agnes Mueller's boarding house, a small but clean space that served as both bedroom and makeshift sewing room. The window faced east, providing good light for detailed work, and Agnes had proven to be not only a considerate landlady, but her first regular customer. The older woman's arthritis made fine needlework impossible, but her standards for her appearance remained exacting. Nora had spent hours altering Agnes's dresses to accommodate her changing figure, letting out seams here, taking in fabric there, making the adjustments that allowed dignity to coexist with the limitations of aging. It was patient work, the kind that built trust along with income, and word of Nora's skill had spread accordingly. But now these stakes had appeared, and with them a new tension in the air that made ordinary conversations feel loaded with unspoken concern. Nora counted at least a dozen of them just on her short walk, driven into lots both occupied and empty, including one that stood like a sentinel in the exact center of her own property. She found Margaret at the general store, stocking shelves with a particular energy that suggested she was working off frustration rather than following normal routine. The other woman looked up as Nora entered, her expression grim. "You've seen them," Margaret said without preamble. "Hard to miss. Any idea what they're surveying for?" Margaret set down the box of canned goods with unnecessary force. "Railroad route, most likely. Though nobody's bothered to tell us residents what they're planning." She gestured toward the window, where several stakes were visible in the distance. "Those surveyors have been through twice now, and each time they ask different questions. First it was about water rights and mineral claims. Now they're measuring lot lines and asking about property deeds." The implications settled over Nora like a cold wind. "They're planning to buy out the town, or condemn it for the greater good of progress," Margaret said bitterly. "Depends on whether they want to negotiate or just take what they need." She lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Silas Crane's been making the rounds again, offering to buy properties at what he calls fair market value. Funny how his idea of fair seems to change, depending on how desperate the seller looks." Nora thought of the stake driven into her lot, marking her small piece of hope for someone else's surveying purposes. She'd worked so hard these past weeks to build something sustainable, taking in enough sewing to pay her room and board, while slowly saving toward construction costs. The baby had grown noticeably in that time, her condition becoming obvious to anyone who looked her way, but rather than making customers uncomfortable, her obvious need for steady work had generated sympathy and support. Dr. Harrison had examined her the previous week, pronouncing both mother and child healthy and estimating she had perhaps 2.5 months before delivery. It was cutting things close, but Nora had been confident she could establish her business and find more permanent housing before the baby arrived. Now, with these stakes suggesting that the entire town might be subject to forced change, her carefully laid plans felt suddenly fragile. "Has anyone tried to find out what the railroad actually intends?" she asked. Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Tom tried talking to the surveyors. They said they were just gathering information, nothing official yet. But when he pressed them about whose information they were gathering it for, they got tight-lipped quick enough." She paused, then added, "Though one of them let slip that they'd be meeting with a representative from the territorial government next week, something about easements and eminent domain." The words hit Nora like physical blows. Eminent domain meant the government could force sales of private property for public projects, usually at prices determined by officials rather than market negotiations. If the railroad decided it needed to run tracks through Esperanza, individual property owners would have little recourse but to accept whatever compensation was offered. "My deed is legitimate," Nora said, more to herself than to Margaret. "I have all the paperwork paid in full through the Territorial Land Office." "I'm sure it is, but legitimate doesn't always matter when there's enough money and political influence involved." Margaret's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm not trying to scare you, Nora. Maybe nothing will come of this. Maybe they're just considering options and will decide to route the railroad somewhere else. But I should be prepared for the worst," Nora finished. It was the story of her life lately, building something, only to watch it threatened by forces beyond her control. Thomas's death, the flood, and now this. She was beginning to feel like she was fighting a war against circumstances that changed faster than she could adapt to them. The bell above the store's door chimed, and both women looked up to see Silas Crane entering with his practiced smile and calculating eyes. He'd been a persistent presence in town since Nora's arrival, always polite, always helpful, always ready with offers that sounded generous until you examined them closely. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat, "beautiful morning, isn't it? Though I imagine you've noticed our new decorations around town." He gestured vaguely toward the window and the visible stakes beyond. "Hard to miss them," Margaret replied coolly. "Care to enlighten us about what they represent?" Crane's smile widened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Progress, Mrs. Wells. The inevitable march of civilization across our great territory." He turned to Nora, his expression taking on a paternal quality that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Gaines, I do hope you've given some thought to our previous conversation. These recent developments make my offer even more relevant to your situation." "What recent developments?" Nora asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Why, the railroad survey, of course. Word is that the territorial government is very interested in establishing a direct line between Tucson and Santa Fe, and Esperanza sits right in the path of the most logical route." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Of course, that means significant changes for the community. Some might call them improvements, others might find them disruptive." Margaret stepped closer to Nora, a gesture of solidarity that Crane noted with amusement. "And I suppose you just happen to know about these plans before anyone else in town." "I make it my business to stay informed about developments that might affect my investments," Crane replied smoothly. "Information is valuable, Mrs. Wells, almost as valuable as being positioned to help one's neighbors navigate uncertain times." The veiled threat was clear enough. Crane had advanced knowledge of the railroad's plans, probably through connections with territorial officials or railroad executives. He was using that information to pressure property owners into selling before they learned the full scope of what was coming. "My property isn't for sale, Mr. Crane," Nora said firmly. "Whatever the railroad's plans, I intend to honor my commitment to this community." Crane's expression shifted subtly, the paternal mask slipping enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Admirable sentiment, Mrs. Gaines, but sentiment doesn't always align with reality. The railroad brings change whether we welcome it or not. Those who adapt early tend to fare better than those who resist." "Is that a threat?" "Merely an observation. His smile returned, but it felt different now, less performative and more predatory. Though I will say that your particular situation, a woman alone, expecting a child, with limited resources, makes flexibility even more important. The territorial government isn't known for its patience with property owners who stand in the way of progress. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Nora felt her temper rising, the same fierce independence that had driven her to repair her own wagon, now pushing her to reject this man's manipulative concern. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through widowhood and loss, "I appreciate your observations. But I've survived worse than railroad surveys and territorial politics. I'll take my chances with whatever changes come." For a moment, something ugly flickered across Crane's features, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough. When he spoke again, his tone carried a new edge. "Of course you will, Mrs. Gaines. I'm sure you're quite resourceful." He adjusted his watch chain, a gesture that drew attention to his prosperity. "Though I do hope you won't regret choosing stubbornness over prudence. The territory can be unforgiving to those who misjudge their position." He tipped his hat once more and left without another word, the door's bell chiming his departure with cheerful incongruity. In the silence that followed, Nora felt the weight of what she'd just committed herself to, a battle against forces that had money, political connections, and the power of eminent domain on their side. "You made an enemy just then," Margaret said quietly. "I was already his enemy," Nora replied. "I just stopped pretending otherwise." She spent the rest of the morning visiting her regular customers, ostensibly to collect finished work and discuss new projects, but really to gauge the community's mood and gather information about the railroad survey. The reactions were mixed. Some folks were excited about the prospect of easier transportation and increased commerce, while others worried about losing the close-knit character that made Esperanza feel like home. What emerged from these conversations was a picture of a community caught between hope and fear, unsure whether the coming changes would bring prosperity or displacement. Most had heard rumors about forced sales and government pressure, but few had concrete information about the railroad's actual plans or timeline. Dr. Harrison, examining Nora's progress during her weekly appointment, was more direct than most. "I've seen what railroad development does to small towns," he said as he listened to the baby's heartbeat. "Sometimes it brings growth and opportunity. Sometimes it brings speculators and corruption that destroy everything decent about a place." He folded his stethoscope with deliberate care. "Either way, it brings change faster than most folks are prepared to handle." "What would you do in my situation?" Nora asked. The doctor was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I'd gather allies," he said finally. "Whatever's coming, you'll face it better with friends than alone. And I'd document everything: deeds, payments, any correspondence with territorial officials. Paper trails matter when lawyers get involved." That evening, Nora sat in her small room working on a dress for Agnes while her mind churned through possibilities and plans. The surveyor's stakes represented more than just measurement points. They were declarations of intent, warnings that change was coming whether the community welcomed it or not. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her agitation, and Nora rested her hand on her belly while continuing to stitch. She'd come to Esperanza seeking stability and independence, a place where she could build a life for herself and her child. Now that future felt threatened by forces she barely understood, much less could control. But she'd faced impossible odds before, and survived. The trick was figuring out how to turn those surveyors' stakes from threats into opportunities, how to use the coming changes to strengthen rather than destroy what she was trying to build. Outside her window, the stakes stood silhouetted against the starlit sky like tiny tombstones, marking the death of Esperanza's quiet anonymity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, new attempts to convince her that selling out was her only rational choice. She'd prove them wrong, just as she'd proven wrong every other person who'd underestimated her capacity for stubborn determination. The railroad might be coming, but Nora Gaines wasn't going anywhere. The baby's quilt lay half-finished across Nora's lap, its carefully stitched squares, telling the story of her journey west in fabric and thread. Each piece came from somewhere meaningful: a scrap of blue from her wedding dress, yellow cotton from a dress Thomas had admired, green calico from the first fabric she'd purchased in Colorado. The pattern was simple but elegant, designed to grow more beautiful with age and use, like the love it represented. 7 months pregnant now, Nora felt the weight of both the child and the approaching deadline pressing against her ribs as she worked by lamplight in her small room. Agnes had gone to bed hours ago, but sleep eluded Nora these days, her mind too busy cataloguing problems and potential solutions to find rest easily. It had been 2 weeks since the surveyor's stakes appeared, 2 weeks of mounting tension as rumors circulated about railroad plans and government intentions. The territorial representative had indeed come through town, spending a day meeting with select property owners, though notably, neither Nora nor any of the other smaller landholders had been invited to participate in those discussions. What they learned came second-hand, through fragments of conversation overheard at the general store and passed along with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. The railroad was definitely coming through Esperanza. The route was still being finalized. Property acquisitions would begin within the month. Compensation would be fair and based on assessed value. Resistance would be met with legal action. Each rumor felt like another stitch in a noose that was slowly tightening around her carefully laid plans. Nora had contacted the Territorial Land Office to confirm her deed and inquire about her rights as a property owner, but the response had been maddeningly vague, full of legal language about public necessity and eminent domain that essentially told her she owned her land until the government decided it needed it more. Clayton Ridge had appeared twice more since their first meeting, ostensibly on business in town, but always finding time to stop by Margaret's store when Nora was likely to be there. Their conversations were polite, formal, carefully observed by the small community that had nothing better to do than speculate about the wealthy rancher's interest in their newest resident. The attention made Nora uncomfortable, not because Clayton was inappropriate, his behavior remained scrupulously correct, but because she could see the growing attachment in his eyes, the way he looked at her, as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. She'd made it clear that she wasn't interested in romantic entanglements, but his persistence suggested he viewed her refusal as a challenge rather than a final answer. More troubling was her own, growing awareness of him. Clayton Ridge was intelligent, successful, and undeniably attractive in the weathered way of men who'd built their fortunes through hard work rather than inheritance. He treated her with respect, never condescended to her about her condition or circumstances, and seemed genuinely interested in her opinions on subjects ranging from territorial politics to the challenges of desert agriculture. Under different circumstances, she might have welcomed his attention. But these weren't different circumstances. She was 7 months pregnant with another man's child, financially dependent on the goodwill of a community that was already gossiping about her association with Clayton, and facing the possible loss of the property that represented her only path to independence. The last thing she needed was the complication of feelings she couldn't afford to have for a man whose wealth and position made him part of the very system that threatened her security. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Agnes Mueller stood in the hallway, wrapped in a worn robe and holding a cup of tea that steamed in the cool night air. "Saw your light still burning," the older woman said. "Thought you might need some company." Nora accepted the tea gratefully, gesturing for Agnes to take the room's single chair while she remained on the narrow bed with her quilting. They'd developed an easy friendship over the past month, built on shared appreciation for careful craftsmanship and the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving life's inevitable disappointments. "Can't sleep again?" Agnes asked, settling herself with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested sudden changes in position. "Too much on my mind," Nora admitted. "This business with the railroad has me wondering if I've made a terrible mistake coming here." Agnes was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea and studying the partially completed quilt. "Pretty work?" she said finally. "Your baby's going to treasure this someday, knowing how much love went into every stitch. If I manage to finish it before everything falls apart." "Things have a way of working out," Agnes said mildly. "Maybe not the way we plan, but they work out nonetheless. I've seen enough changes in my 73 years to know that what looks like disaster sometimes turns into opportunity, given enough time and the right perspective." Nora wanted to believe that, but optimism felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. "What if the railroad takes my land? What if I can't build my shop? I don't have anywhere else to go, Agnes. This was supposed to be my fresh start." "Fresh starts don't come with guarantees," Agnes replied. "But they also don't depend on external circumstances as much as we think they do. You've got skills, determination, and friends who care about you. That's more than a lot of folks can say." The kindness in her voice made Nora's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Pregnancy had made her more sensitive to everything, but Agnes's support felt particularly precious, given how isolated she'd felt since Thomas's death. "I keep thinking about what my husband would do in this situation," Nora said. "He was good at seeing angles I missed, finding solutions where I only saw problems." "And what do you think he'd tell you now?" Nora considered the question seriously, picturing Thomas's face as he worked through a difficult decision. He'd been methodical in his approach to challenges, always gathering information before committing to a course of action. "He'd tell me to find out exactly what I'm up against before I start fighting it," she said slowly. "And he'd remind me that sometimes the best defense is making yourself too valuable to dispose of." Agnes nodded approvingly. "Smart man. How do you make yourself valuable to people who want your land?" The question hung in the air between them, and Nora felt something shift in her thinking. She'd been approaching the railroad situation as a victim, someone who had something to lose. But what if she repositioned herself as someone who had something to offer? "The town needs businesses that serve railroad workers and travelers," she said, thinking aloud. "A seamstress who can handle repairs, alterations, even basic tailoring for new clothes. If I could demonstrate that my shop would be an asset to the new Esperanza rather than an obstacle." "Now you're thinking like someone who solves problems instead of just worrying about them," Agnes said with satisfaction. "What else?" Nora's mind began working faster, possibilities opening up like flowers after rain. "I could talk to other business owners, see if we can present a united front. Instead of individual property owners being picked off one by one, we could negotiate as a group. Maybe even propose our own development plan that incorporates the railroad while preserving what makes this community worth living in." "Better yet," Agnes said, warming to the theme. "And who do you know with connections to both the railroad industry and territorial government?" The answer was obvious, though Nora resisted it instinctively. Clayton Ridge had mentioned railroad investors during their first meeting, and his successful businesses had clearly required navigating territorial politics. He would have the contacts and credibility to represent the community's interests in negotiations. "I can't ask Clayton for help," she said. "People already talk about us enough as it is." "People will talk regardless of what you do," Agnes replied pragmatically. "The question is whether you let their gossip prevent you from doing what's necessary to protect your future." She leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "That man has feelings for you, Nora. I've seen the way he looks at you, and I've lived long enough to recognize genuine interest when I see it. Maybe it's time to stop running from that fact and start considering whether it might be an advantage rather than a complication." The suggestion made Nora deeply uncomfortable, touching on fears and desires she'd been trying to ignore. Using Clayton's attraction to her for political purposes felt manipulative, even if the cause was just. "I won't trade on a man's feelings for my own benefit," she said firmly. "That's not who I am." "I'm not suggesting you trade on anything," Agnes said patiently. "I'm suggesting you stop assuming that accepting help means losing independence. Clayton Ridge isn't trying to rescue you or control you, he's trying to court you. There's a difference." The words hit closer to home than Nora cared to admit. She had been treating Clayton's interest as if it were an attempt to manage her life, when his actual behavior suggested something far more respectful. He'd never tried to override her decisions or assume authority over her choices. If anything, his obvious fascination with her independence suggested he valued her strength rather than wanting to diminish it. "Even if that's true," she said, "I'm not ready for courtship. I may never be ready." Agnes finished her tea and stood to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Nora with an expression of gentle understanding. "Ready or not, life keeps moving forward," she said. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop trying to control every aspect of our circumstances and start trusting that good people will help us when we need it most." She smiled. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man, but he's gone, and you're still here. That baby you're carrying deserves a mother who's willing to fight for the best possible future, even if that future looks different from what you originally planned." After Agnes left, Nora sat in the lamplight, working on the quilt and thinking about courage, trust, and the difference between independence and isolation. The baby moved restlessly, reminding her that her decisions affected more than just herself now. Outside, the surveyor's stakes stood like silent sentinels, marking territory that might soon belong to someone else entirely. But inside this small room, surrounded by the evidence of her skill and determination, Nora felt the first stirrings of a plan that might just be bold enough to work. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of making herself indispensable to Esperanza's future. And if that meant swallowing her pride enough to ask Clayton Ridge for help, then perhaps it was time to learn the difference between dependence and partnership. The quilt took shape beneath her hands, each stitch a small act of faith in tomorrow, each pattern a declaration that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Her child would be born into uncertainty, but also into a legacy of strength and stubborn hope that no railroad survey could measure or government decree could condemn. The forged documents lay spread across Dr. Harrison's desk like evidence of a crime, which Nora was beginning to realize they essentially were. Margaret Wells sat beside her, face pale with shock, while the doctor studied the papers with the careful attention he usually reserved for difficult diagnoses. It had started that morning when Margaret arrived at the boarding house in a state of barely controlled agitation, clutching a leather portfolio and demanding to speak with Nora immediately. The story that emerged was almost too outrageous to believe, except that the evidence was right there in black and white. Margaret's husband, Tom, had been approached the previous evening by a strangera, nervous young man who claimed to work for Silas Crane, but was apparently having second thoughts about his employer's methods. The man had stolen copies of documents from Crane's files, papers that revealed the true scope of the land speculation scheme that had been targeting Esperanza for months. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a letter bearing the territorial seal. "This purports to be official correspondence from the Territorial Land Office, confirming that the railroad has been granted eminent domain authority over specific properties in Esperanza. But look at the date." Nora leaned closer, studying the elegant script. The letter was dated 3 weeks before the surveyor's stakes had appeared, which would have been impressive advance planning, except for one crucial detail. That's 2 days before the territorial legislature even convened to discuss railroad expansion. "Dr. Harrison observed grimly, "I was in Santa Fe for a medical conference that week. The railroad bill wasn't introduced until the following session." The implications were staggering. Someone had been forging territorial documents to support their land acquisition scheme, creating an appearance of legal authority that didn't actually exist. Silas Crane hadn't been operating as an advance agent for legitimate railroad development, been running an elaborate confidence game designed to pressure property owners into selling at below market prices. "There's more," Margaret said, shuffling through the papers. "Purchase agreements showing that Crane has been buying properties under multiple false identities, then consolidating ownership under a company called Desert Development Corporation. And look at this correspondence with railroad executives, but not about routing decisions, about property acquisition costs and profit margins." Nora felt sick as the full picture emerged. Crane and his associates were planning to buy up Esperanza cheaply using the threat of eminent domain, then sell to the railroad at a substantial markup when the actual development began. The surveyor's stakes, the territorial representative's visit, even the rumors about forced sales, all of it had been orchestrated to create panic and pressure residents into accepting lowball offers. "But where does that leave us?" she asked. "If the railroad development is real but Crane's authority isn't, what happens to people who've already sold to him?" Dr. Harrison was studying another document, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "That depends on who his partners are in this venture." He looked up at the two women with something that might have been sympathy or might have been professional concern. "There's a name on these incorporation papers that you both need to see. The primary investor in Desert Development Corporation is listed as Sea Ridge Enterprises." The words hit Nora like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and making her grip the edge of the desk for support. Clayton Ridge, the man who'd rescued her from the flood, who'd been courting her with apparent sincerity, who'd positioned himself as someone she could trust, was apparently a partner in the scheme that threatened to destroy her future. "That can't be right," she said, though even as she spoke, pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place with horrible clarity. Clayton's mysterious business in Santa Fe, his detailed knowledge of railroad plans and territorial politics, his convenient appearances in Esperanza whenever pressure on property owners intensified, his persistent courtship of a woman whose land holdings made her a valuable target. "I'm afraid it is," Margaret said gently. Tom verified the incorporation records through a contact at the territorial office. Sea Ridge Enterprises provided the initial funding for Desert Development Corporation 6 months ago. The betrayal was so complete, so calculating, that Nora felt physically ill. She'd prided herself on her ability to read people, to recognize dishonesty and manipulation. Yet she'd been completely taken in by Clayton's apparent integrity, his respectful courtship, his seeming concern for her welfare. How many of their conversations had been reconnaissance missions, gathering information about her financial situation and emotional vulnerabilities? How many of his questions about her plans and dreams had been designed to help him craft the perfect approach to separate her from her property? "The baby," she whispered, one hand moving instinctively to her rounded belly. "He knew about the baby. He knew I'd be desperate to provide security." "Don't," Dr. Harrison said firmly, "don't blame yourself for trusting someone who worked very hard to appear trustworthy. This kind of deception requires skill and planning. You're not the first person to be fooled by a professional confidence man." But the logic did nothing to ease the sense of violation that washed over her. Every moment of attraction she'd felt, every time she'd caught herself thinking about him with something warmer than gratitude, every instance when she'd wondered if perhaps he was being too stubborn about maintaining her independence, all of it had been based on a lie. Worse, she'd been considering Agnes's advice about accepting his help with the railroad negotiations. If she'd acted on that impulse, she would have walked straight into the trap he'd been laying for months. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked. "If we confront Crane publicly without solid proof of forgery, he'll just destroy the evidence and disappear. But if we wait too long, more people might sell their properties based on his false claims." Dr. Harrison gathered the papers carefully, his movements deliberate and precise. "We need to get this information to legitimate territorial authorities, people who can verify the forgeries and investigate the conspiracy. But that takes time, and meanwhile, Crane will continue pressuring property owners." "He's been after my land since the day I arrived," Nora said, her voice steadying as anger began to replace shock. "Getting rid of me was probably part of the plan from the beginning. A pregnant widow with no local connections would be an easy target for intimidation." The realization brought with it a cold clarity that cut through her emotional turmoil. She'd been played expertly, but the game wasn't over yet. Crane and his associates, including Clayton Ridge, had underestimated her capacity for survival when they'd targeted her as a vulnerable mark. "I want to see them all," she said quietly. "Every document, every piece of evidence your contact was able to steal. If I'm going to fight this, I need to understand exactly what we're up against." Margaret and Dr. Harrison exchanged glances, and she could see her own determination reflected in their expressions. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The community that Crane had tried to divide and conquer was beginning to unite against a common threat. "There's something else," Margaret said reluctantly. "Something that might affect your decision about how to proceed." She pulled out one final document, this one bearing Clayton Ridge's personal letterhead. "It's a letter to Crane dated last week." Nora took the paper with hands that trembled slightly, steeling herself for whatever new betrayal might be revealed. But as she read, confusion replaced anger. The letter was brief and businesslike, but its content was completely unexpected. "Effective immediately, Sea Ridge Enterprises withdraws all financial support from Desert Development Corporation," she read aloud. "Furthermore, I hereby terminate any business relationship with Silas Crane and dissociate myself from his activities in Esperanza and surrounding areas." She looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "This is dated 3 days ago." "Keep reading," Margaret said softly. The final paragraph made Nora's heart skip. "Recent information has come to my attention, suggesting that my investment was obtained under false pretenses and is being used for purposes contrary to the representations made to me initially. I will be conducting my own investigation into these matters and will cooperate fully with any territorial inquiry into irregular land acquisition practices in the Esperanza region." The letter was signed with a bold signature that matched the one she'd seen on the incorporation documents, but its tone and content suggested something very different from criminal conspiracy. It read like the reaction of someone who'd discovered he was being used rather than the communication of a willing participant in fraud. "I don't understand," Nora said. "If he's withdrawing from the corporation, if he's promising to cooperate with investigations, then maybe he's not the villain in this story," Dr. Harrison said thoughtfully. "Maybe he's another victim of Crane's deception. Someone whose legitimate business investment was perverted into something criminal without his knowledge." The possibility opened up new questions that were almost as disturbing as the original betrayal. If Clayton was innocent of deliberate fraud, then her assumptions about his motivations were completely wrong. His interest in her might be genuine rather than calculated. His courtship might be honest rather than manipulative. But it also meant she'd been living in a state of paranoid suspicion, attributing the worst possible motives to someone who might actually care about her welfare. The thought was almost as painful as the original discovery of his apparent involvement in Crane's scheme. "We need to talk to him," she said finally. "Before we do anything else, I need to know the truth about his involvement. If he's innocent, then we have a powerful ally in fighting Crane's operation. If he's not, then you're walking into the lion's den," Margaret finished. "Nora, are you sure you want to take that risk? We could handle this without involving him at all." But Nora was already standing, her decision made. The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, as if endorsing her resolve to face the truth regardless of its personal cost. "I've been running from complications since Thomas died," she said. "Running from grief, from trust, from the possibility of caring about someone again. But I can't run from this. If Clayton Ridge is the man I thought he was, then I need to know. And if he's not," she straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar steel of determination flow through her, "then I need to know that too." The forged documents had revealed one conspiracy, but they'd also raised the possibility of another kind of deception, entirely the kind that came from assuming the worst about people who might actually deserve better. Tomorrow, Nora would discover which version of the truth would shape her future. The telegraph key clicked out its urgent message in the steady rhythm that had become as familiar to Nora as her own heartbeat over the past 3 days. Clayton sat hunched over the device in the corner of the general store, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he transmitted yet another inquiry to territorial authorities in Santa Fe. The confrontation with Clayton had been nothing like what Nora had expected. When she'd arrived at his hotel room armed with accusations and evidence, She'd found him surrounded by his own collection of suspicious documents, contracts that didn't match his original agreements, correspondence that had been altered between drafts, financial records that showed his investment being diverted to purposes he'd never authorized. "I should have seen it sooner," he'd said after reviewing the papers Margaret had brought. "Crane approached me 6 months ago with a proposal for legitimate development investment. The railroad was definitely coming through this region. That part was true, and he claimed to represent a consortium of local property owners who wanted to ensure fair compensation for their land." The explanation had been delivered with the flat tone of a man discovering his own gullibility, and Nora had found herself believing him despite her determination to remain skeptical. Clayton's anger at being deceived had been too genuine to fake, his frustration at having his name associated with fraud too personal to be an act. "He showed me correspondence from the territorial office, maps from railroad surveyors, even testimonials from supposed property owners who'd benefited from his services in other towns," Clayton continued. "Everything looked legitimate because he was very good at making it look legitimate." What had emerged from comparing their evidence was a picture of a conspiracy far more elaborate than anyone had imagined. Crane hadn't just been forging territorial document, she'd been creating an entire fictional network of business relationships, using Clayton's reputation and financial backing to legitimize his operations while keeping his actual investor ignorant of the criminal methods being employed. The real railroad development was genuine, but it was still months away from requiring property acquisitions. Crane had been using the threat of immediate eminent domain to pressure residents into selling quickly before they could investigate his claims or seek independent legal advice. "The bastard played us all," Clayton had said grimly. "He used my money to fund his confidence game, my name to provide credibility, and my absence from town to operate without oversight. By the time I realized something was wrong, he'd already approached half the property owners in Esperanza with false claims about territorial authority. Now they were racing against time to expose the fraud before more residents fell victim to Crane's deception." Clayton had immediately begun using his political and business connections to alert territorial officials, while Nora and Margaret worked to document which properties had been targeted and which residents might be vulnerable to further pressure. The telegraph had become their lifeline to justice, its clicking rhythm carrying urgent messages between Esperanza and the territorial capital. Clayton's reputation opened doors that would have remained closed to the local residents, and his detailed knowledge of territorial politics helped him navigate the bureaucratic maze that might have delayed action for months. "Response from Judge Morrison," Clayton announced, tearing the latest message from the machine. "He's issuing warrants for Crane's arrest on charges of fraud and forgery. The territorial marshal will be here within the week to take him into custody." Margaret looked up from the ledger where she'd been recording property sales and attempted sales throughout the region. "What about the people who already sold to him? Can those transactions be voided?" "That depends on what we can prove about the methods he used," Clayton replied. "If we can demonstrate that the sales were obtained through false claims about eminent domain, forged documents, deliberate misrepresentation, then yes, the transactions can be reversed." Nora felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by practical concerns. But what if he disappears before the marshal arrives? He's not stupid. He must know that his scheme can't continue indefinitely. It was a valid worry. Crane had been conspicuously absent from town for the past 2 days, and his usual rounds of property visits had stopped abruptly. Some residents reported seeing him in deep conversation with strangers at the hotel, men who didn't look like railroad executives or territorial officials. "I've been thinking about that," Clayton said, moving away from the telegraph to join them at the table where they'd spread out maps and property records. "Crane's invested too much time and money in this operation to simply walk away. He's got purchase agreements pending on at least a dozen properties, and if the real railroad development proceeds as planned, those holdings could be worth a fortune." "So what's his next move?" Margaret asked. Clayton pointed to a cluster of properties on the map, all of them marked with red ink to indicate Crane's interest. "He's going to try to close these deals immediately, before word spreads about the investigation. Push for quick sales, maybe even use intimidation if necessary. Once he has clear title to enough land, he can disappear and wait for the railroad to make him rich. The properties included Nora's lot, along with several other prime locations along the proposed railroad route. If Crane succeeded in acquiring them through fraud, the financial loss to the community would be devastating, and the legal battle to recover them could drag on for years. "We need to warn everyone on his target list," Nora said. "Make sure they know about the forged documents and the pending investigation." "Already started," Margaret replied, indicating a second list of names. "Tom's been making rounds this morning, and Dr. Harrison is talking to his patients. But some folks are scared enough of government intervention that they might sell anyway, just to avoid getting caught up in legal proceedings." The complexity of the situation was frustrating. Even with evidence of Crane's criminal activities, some residents might choose to accept his offers rather than risk losing everything if the case went badly. Fear made people do illogical things, and Crane had been very effective at spreading fear. "There's something else," Clayton said, his expression growing more serious. "I received a message this morning from my foreman. 3 men arrived at my ranch yesterday, asking questions about my involvement with Desert Development Corporation. They claimed to be representing investors, but their questions were more like an interrogation. The implication was clear. Crane's associates were trying to assess how much Clayton knew and whether he posed a threat to their operation. If they concluded that he was actively working against them, intimidation might escalate to more direct action. "You should leave town," Nora said immediately. "Go back to your ranch where you have protection." Clayton's smile was grim but appreciative. "And leave you here to face whatever comes next alone? I don't think so. This isn't your fight anymore. You've done what you can to alert the authorities." "This became my fight the moment Crane used my name and money to threaten people I care about," he interrupted, his voice carrying an intensity that made Nora's pulse quicken. "I'm not running away from my responsibilities, and I'm not abandoning you to clean up a mess that I helped create, even if I didn't know I was creating it." The determination in his voice reminded Nora of her own refusal to back down from challenges, and she recognized the futility of trying to argue him out of a position he'd chosen on principle. Clayton Ridge was as stubborn as she was, which was both reassuring and terrifying, given the circumstances they faced. "Then we need a plan," she said practically. "If Crane is going to make his final push before the marshal arrives, we need to be ready for whatever methods he might use." They spent the next hour developing contingencies, identifying the most vulnerable residents and creating a communication network that could spread warnings quickly throughout the community. Dr. Harrison's medical practice gave him natural access to most families, while Margaret's position at the general store made her a natural clearinghouse for information. Clayton's role was more complex. His wealth and connections made him valuable as a coordinator and spokesman, but those same qualities also made him a target for Crane's associates. They decided he would maintain a visible presence in town, while secretly coordinating with territorial authorities to ensure the marshal's arrival would catch Crane before he could complete his scheme or escape with his ill-gotten gains. As the afternoon wore on, reports began filtering in about unusual activity around town. Strangers had been seen watching the homes of specific residents, the same ones on Crane's target list. The hotel clerk reported that Crane had checked out, but left instructions for messages to be held at the desk, suggesting he planned to return. Most ominously, several residents reported being approached by men who claimed to represent the territorial government, offering immediate cash payments for their properties with the warning that refusing might result in forced seizure without compensation. The tactics were becoming more aggressive, more desperate, as if Crane sensed that his time was running out. "He's making his move," Clayton said after receiving the latest report. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after, he'll try to close every deal he can before disappearing." Nora felt the baby kick restlessly, responding to her elevated stress levels. At 8 months pregnant, she was increasingly uncomfortable, but the approaching crisis left no room for personal concerns. Too much depended on the next few days' own future, the community's survival, and justice for all the people who'd been targeted by Crane's elaborate deception. "What if we turned his own tactics against him?" she said suddenly, an idea beginning to form. "He's been using false authority and manufactured urgency to pressure people into selling. What if we used real authority and genuine urgency to convince them to hold on just a little longer?" Clayton and Margaret looked at her expectantly, and Nora felt the familiar thrill of a plan coming together in her mind. The territorial marshal's arrival isn't just about arresting Cranites, about validating legitimate property rights and protecting residents from fraud. If we can convince people that selling to Crane now would actually put them at legal risk, that they might be seen as participants in his scheme rather than victims, they'll refuse his offers and wait for official resolution. Margaret finished, understanding immediately. "It's risky we'd be making promises about legal outcomes we can't guarantee. But it's also truthful," Clayton added. "Anyone who sells property they know was obtained through fraud could face legal complications. We wouldn't be lying about the risks." The plan was simple but required perfect timing. They would spread word throughout the community that the territorial marshal was en route with arrest warrants and instructions to investigate all recent property transactions. Residents would be advised that any sales completed after the investigation began might be subject to additional scrutiny and potential legal consequences. It wasn't foolproof. Crane might still find residents desperate enough to take their chances, but it would create doubt and delay that could buy time for the marshal's arrival. "There's one more thing," Nora said, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her all day. "If Crane realizes he's facing arrest and his scheme is falling apart, he might decide that getting rid of the people who exposed him is worth the risk." The thought hung in the air between them, acknowledging the danger they all faced by taking an active role in opposing Crane's operation. But none of them suggested backing down, and Nora felt a surge of pride in the courage her new community was showing. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, one way or another. The telegraph key sat silent now, its work done, but the connections it had forged between Esperanza and the forces of justice would soon bear fruit. All they had to do was survive long enough to see Crane's empire of deception crumble around him. As evening settled over the town, Nora felt the weight of approaching motherhood and approaching conflict, pressing against her with equal intensity. The baby would be born into a world shaped by the choices made in the next few days, and she was determined to ensure that world was one where justice prevailed over greed, community over exploitation, and truth over the beautiful lies that men like Silas Crane used to prey on hope and desperation. The clicking of the telegraph key had carried their urgent messages to the territorial capital, but tomorrow would require a different kind of communication, the kind that came from standing together against common threats and refusing to let fear drive them into making decisions they would regret for the rest of their lives. The hand-carved cradle rocked gently in the corner of Nora's new shop, its smooth wooden sides gleaming with the care Clayton had lavished on every detail during the weeks leading up to Eleanor's birth. The piece was a masterwork of patient craftsmanship, each curve and joint shaped with the precision of a man who understood that some gifts carried the weight of promise as well as affection. 6 months had passed since that chaotic day when justice and new life had converged in the back room of Margaret's general store. 6 months of healing, building, and the careful construction of something that neither Nora nor Clayton had dared hope for during their first tentative conversations on a dusty desert trail. Esperanza had emerged from the Crane crisis stronger and more united than before. The railroad had indeed come through as promised, but on terms negotiated by the community rather than dictated by speculators. Property owners received fair compensation for easements, new businesses opened to serve railroad workers and travelers, and the town's character remained intact despite the changes. Nora's seamstress shop occupied the lot she'd fought so hard to keep, its bright windows facing Main Street and its comfortable interior designed to welcome customers who needed everything from simple alterations to custom wedding gowns. The sign above the door read, Gaines, Ridge Fine Tailoring, reflecting the partnership that had grown from shared crisis into something deeper and more enduring. Eleanor gurgled contentedly in her cradle, 6 months old, and already showing signs of her mother's determination in the way she gripped anything placed within reach of her tiny fingers. She had Nora's green eyes and what appeared to be Thomas's stubborn chin, but her smile was entirely her own, a radiant expression that transformed even the most mundane moments into celebrations. "She's going to be trouble," Clayton observed from where he sat at the shop's small desk, reviewing orders and correspondence. "I can already see it in her eyes." "Good," Nora replied, without looking up from the dress she was hemming for Agnes Mueller. "The world needs more women who know how to cause the right kind of trouble." Their marriage had taken place 3 months after Eleanor's birth, a simple ceremony in the town's church, with the entire community in attendance. Judge Morrison had performed the service during his return visit to finalize the legal proceedings against Crane, adding a note of celebration to what might otherwise have been a purely administrative trip. The wedding had been Nora's idea, proposed during one of their evening conversations when Eleanor was sleeping and they could speak freely about the future they were building together. Clayton had been courting her with patient determination, but he'd made it clear that he would wait as long as necessary for her to feel ready for such a commitment. "I'm not marrying you because I need rescuing," she'd told him the night she accepted his proposal. "I'm marrying you because I want a partner, someone who understands that strength shared is stronger than strength hoarded." He'd understood perfectly, just as she'd known he would. Their relationship had been forged in crisis and tested by deception, but what emerged was something neither had expected: a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep affection that developed between people who'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. The business partnership had been as carefully negotiated as the personal one. Clayton's investment had provided the capital needed to construct and stock the shop, while Nora's skills and community connections made it profitable. But the arrangement went beyond simple financial cooperation. They'd created something that honored both their strengths while addressing the practical challenges of building a life together in a small frontier town. "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you can have her daughter's quinceañera dress ready by next Friday," Clayton said, scanning through the morning's correspondence. "And there's an order from the railroad office for work shirts apparently. Our reputation is spreading beyond Esperanza." The success still surprised Nora sometimes. She'd envisioned a modest shop serving local needs, but the quality of their work and the novelty of their partnership had attracted attention from throughout the region. Railroad workers appreciated durable, well-fitted clothing, while their wives and daughters valued the kind of careful alterations that made store-bought garments look custom-made. "Tell Mrs. Rodriguez yes, but she'll need to bring Maria in for a final fitting by Wednesday," Nora replied. "And accept the railroad order, but make it clear that work shirts are Clayton's department. I have enough to do with the ladies' garments." It was a division of labor that had evolved naturally. Nora handled the intricate work that required her trained eye and steady hand, while Clayton managed the simpler but volume-heavy orders that utilized skills he'd developed maintaining his ranch operations. The arrangement allowed them to take on more business while playing to their individual strengths. Eleanor chose that moment to wake from her nap, announcing her return to consciousness with the imperious cry of someone accustomed to prompt attention. Nora set aside her sewing and lifted the baby from her cradle, settling into the rocking chair that had been Thomas's gift to her during her first pregnancy, own of the few possessions that had survived the flood and made the journey to her new life. "Tell me about the railroad contracts," she said as she began nursing Eleanor. "Are they talking about extending the line further west?" Clayton looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting to the focused attention he gave to serious business discussions. 6 months of marriage had taught him that Nora's interest in such matters went far beyond casual curiosity. She understood that their business success depended on anticipating changes in the regional economy. "There's talk of connecting to the California lines within the next 5 years," he replied. If that happens, Esperanza could become a major junction point rather than just a stop along the route. More traffic, more opportunities, but also more competition. They'd been having variations of this conversation for weeks, planning for a future that might look very different from their current circumstances. Success brought its own challenges, requiring decisions about expansion, investment, and the balance between growth and the quality of life they'd worked so hard to achieve. "What do you think?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Their business decisions were made jointly, but she valued his broader experience with territorial commerce and his understanding of political and economic trends. Clayton set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the thoroughness she'd come to expect from him. "I think we're in a good position either way," he said finally. "If the railroad expansion happens, we'll have opportunities to grow with it. If it doesn't, we've already established ourselves as the premier tailoring operation in this part of the territory." It was a measured response, but Nora caught the underlying excitement in his voice. Clayton thrived on challenges and opportunities, and the prospect of building something significant appealed to the same ambition that had driven him to success in ranching and mining. "But," she prompted, sensing there was more to his thoughts, "but I don't want growth to come at the expense of what we've built here. This shop, this community, this life, it's good, Nora. Maybe better than anything either of us had before. I'm not eager to risk that for the chance of something bigger." The sentiment reflected a wisdom that Clayton had gained through their shared experiences. He'd learned the difference between success that came from accumulating wealth and power and success that came from building something meaningful with people you cared about. Eleanor finished nursing and settled contentedly against Nora's shoulder, her small hand fisting in the fabric of her mother's dress. At 6 months, she was a remarkably easy baby, content to observe the world around her from her cradle while her parents worked, but also quick to smile and laugh when given attention. "She's going to grow up in a different world than either of us knew," Nora observed, gently patting the baby's back. "More opportunities, more choices, but also more complicated decisions about what matters most. Then we'll make sure she understands the difference between options and obligations." Clayton replied, "Teach her that having choices means taking responsibility for the consequences of those choices." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Wells, who entered the shop with the brisk energy that had made her Nora's first friend in Esperanza and remained one of her closest confidants. Margaret's own life had flourished in the months since the Crane crisis, as her husband's general store expanded to serve the railroad trade, and her role as unofficial community coordinator brought her increasing influence in territorial politics. "Morning, you two," Margaret said, automatically lowering her voice when she noticed Eleanor. "I bring news from the outside world if you're interested." "Always," Nora replied. "What's the latest from Santa Fe?" "Silas Crane was sentenced yesterday. 5 years in territorial prison, plus restitution to everyone he defrauded. Judge Morrison made it clear that the territory takes a dim view of land speculation schemes that prey on honest settlers." The news brought a sense of closure that Nora hadn't realized she needed. Crane had been in custody for months, but the legal proceedings had dragged on through appeals and procedural challenges. Knowing that he would finally face real consequences for his actions felt like the last chapter in a story that had shaped so much of their recent history. "What about his associates?" Clayton asked. "The men who were pressuring people to sell." "Most of them took plea agreements in exchange for testimony against Crane. Shorter sentences, but they'll all serve time." Margaret's expression grew more serious. "Though I should mention that territorial investigators found evidence of similar schemes in other towns. Crane wasn't working alone, and he wasn't the only one targeting frontier communities." The revelation was sobering, but not entirely surprising. Crane's operation had been too sophisticated and well-funded to be the work of a single criminal. The rapid development of the territory created opportunities for both legitimate business and elaborate fraud, and communities like Esperanza would need to remain vigilant against future threats. On a brighter note, Margaret continued, I also have news about the Territorial Development Fund. The legislature approved grants for community improvements in towns along the railroad route. Esperanza qualifies for money to improve our school, upgrade the water system, and build a proper town hall. The grants represented recognition of the community's stability and potential, but they also meant decisions about growth and change that would affect everyone who lived there. Progress brought benefits, but it also brought the kind of complex choices that could divide communities if not handled carefully. How do you feel about that? Nora asked Clayton, genuinely curious about his perspective as someone who'd seen other towns struggle with rapid development. Cautiously optimistic, he replied after a moment's thought. The improvements would make life better for everyone here, but we'll need to be careful about how we manage the growth that follows. Easy to lose what makes a place special if you're not thoughtful about change. Eleanor stirred against Nora's shoulder, making the small sounds that usually preceded either a nap or a demand for entertainment. At 6 months, she was becoming increasingly interested in the world around her, reaching for everything within her limited range, and studying faces with the intense focus of someone cataloging important information. She's gotten so big, Margaret observed, gently stroking the baby's dark hair. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months since that dramatic entrance into the world. The memory still amazed Nora's timing of Eleanor's birth, the way personal and community crises had converged, the sense that her daughter had chosen to arrive at exactly the moment when hope triumphed over fear. It felt like symbolism too perfect for real life. But real life sometimes surprised you with its capacity for meaningful coincidence. Dr. Harrison says she's developing perfectly, Nora said, settling Eleanor back in her cradle as the baby's eyes grew heavy. Strong, healthy, and showing early signs of what he calls determined curiosity. Wonder where she gets that, Clayton said with a smile that encompassed both fondness and mock exasperation. Can't imagine she inherited any stubborn tendencies from her parents. The teasing was gentle and affectionate, the kind of comfortable humor that had developed between them as they learned to navigate married life with all its daily challenges and small joys. They'd both brought strong personalities and firm opinions to their relationship, but they'd also learned when to compromise and when to stand firm. As afternoon wore on, the shop filled with the steady rhythm of productive work. Nora returned to her hemming while Clayton managed correspondence and inventory. Eleanor slept peacefully in her cradle, occasionally making the small sounds and movements that indicated busy dreams. Customers came and went, some for quick alterations, others for lengthy consultations about custom garments. It was, Nora reflected, exactly the kind of life she'd envisioned when she first purchased that empty lot in a town she'd never seen. Not the dramatic romance of novels or the easy prosperity of fairy tales, but something better, a partnership built on shared work and mutual respect, a business that served their community while supporting their family, a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Nora found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief of losing Thomas, the terror of the flood, the uncertainty of arriving in a strange town with nothing but her skills and determination of it, had been necessary to create the circumstances that led to this life. Clayton locked the shop's front door and turned down the lamps, transforming the busy workspace into a peaceful family scene. Eleanor was awake again, content to lie in her cradle and study the play of light and shadow on the ceiling while her parents cleaned up from the day's work. "Any regrets?" Clayton asked quietly, the question emerging from some private contemplation of his own. Nora considered the question seriously, understanding that he was asking about more than just their business or their marriage. He was asking about the choices that had shaped their lives, the roads taken and not taken, the price paid for the contentment they'd found together. "None," she said finally, and meant it completely. Every difficult moment, every loss, every moment of uncertainty, it all led here, to this family, this life, this future we're building together. She moved to the cradle where Eleanor lay, watching them with bright, curious eyes, and lifted her daughter into her arms. The baby settled against her with the perfect trust of someone who'd never known anything but love and security. This little one is going to grow up knowing that the best things in life aren't the easiest ones, Nora said, gently rocking Eleanor as she spoke. She'll learn that strength comes from facing challenges, that love grows stronger when it's tested, and that sometimes the most beautiful futures are built from the pieces of broken dreams. Clayton joined them beside the cradle, his arm settling around Nora's shoulders as they looked down at their daughter together. The hand-carved cradle rocked gently in the lamplight, a symbol of the care and commitment that had created this family from hope, determination, and the kind of love that endured through all circumstances. Outside, Esperanza settled into the peaceful rhythm of another evening, a small town that had learned to face the future with confidence born from surviving the past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight there was only this a family complete, a business thriving, and a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than either of them had dared imagine possible. The cradle continued its gentle motion as Eleanor drifted towards sleep, carrying dreams of a future shaped by the strength of her parents and the love that had brought her into a world where anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it.